Let's get something straight before we even begin. This is not a sex scandal. This is not a personality scandal. This is not a bad optics moment or a PR hiccup. This is a state scandal. And the fact that it took Jeffrey Epstein's corpse and a transatlantic document dump to finally force Britain to look itself in the mirror should tell you everything you need to know about how deep the rot runs. Because this story is not about shock. It's about familiarity. This is about Peter Mandelson, a man who has spent 3 decades floating just above accountability, like oil on water, immune to consequences, allergic to scrutiny, permanently too important to lose. Twice he resigned under Tony Blair. Twice. In any sane political culture, that's the end. In Britain, it's the prelude. He came back as a lord. He came back as a fixer. He came back as a whisperer. He came back as an ambassador. Because Mandelson doesn't hold power the way ordinary politicians do, he channels it. He's not there to be elected. He's there to be useful, and that's where Jeffrey Epstein enters the frame. Just an acquaintance, the most dangerous lie. Let's kill the weakest defense first. You've heard it already. Lots of powerful people knew Epstein. True, and irrelevant. Because the issue is not contact. The issue is continuation. According to documents released from the US Epstein files, Mandelson maintained contact with Epstein after Epstein's 2008 conviction for soliciting underage girls. Not before. After. Not ignorance. After knowledge. Emails show warmth, familiarity, ongoing communication, not distance, not disgust, not rupture. And that alone should have triggered alarms, but it didn't, because the British elite has a different moral operating system. If you're still useful, you're still acceptable. Money, information, and power, the unholy trinity. This is where the story stops being awkward and starts being dangerous. Financial records cited by US investigators indicate payments linked to Epstein, tens of thousands of dollars connected to Mandelson or his partner in the early 2000s. Now pause. This is not about sexual crimes. Mandelson has not been accused of that. This is about proximity to a convicted sexual predator while holding public office, combined with financial entanglement and, most explosively, the alleged sharing of sensitive political information. Investigative reporting suggests Epstein received market-sensitive British government intelligence while Mandelson was a serving minister. Information is power. Information is currency. And Epstein wasn't just a criminal, he was a broker, a node, a collector. Which raises the question Britain has been allergic to asking: what did Epstein want from British power? And why was Mandelson close enough to provide anything at all? That question is now being asked by the police. This is why the police are involved. Let's be precise, because precision matters. As of February 2026, the Metropolitan Police opened a criminal investigation into allegations of misconduct in public office linked to Mandelson's relationship with Epstein. This is not a review. Not an inquiry, not a lessons learned panel, a criminal investigation. Police have searched 2 properties connected to Mandelson as part of that probe. That doesn't happen because Twitter is upset. That happens because evidence exists. And suddenly the jokes stop. The collapse of the adults in the room myth. Here's where the blast radius widens. Because Mandelson didn't just float back into politics quietly. He was appointed UK ambassador to Washington, one of the most sensitive diplomatic roles in British public life. And who approved that? Keir Starmer. Starmer has since apologised not just to the public, but explicitly to Epstein's victims for appointing Mandelson. Read that again. A sitting Prime Minister apologised to victims of one of the most notorious sex traffickers in modern history because of his own appointment decision. That is not normal. That is not small. That is not survivable without consequences. And the consequences came fast. Resignations, collapse and panic. Starmer's top aide resigned after it emerged that Mandelson's Epstein links were known internally but waved through anyway. This is the part defenders hate, because it proves this wasn't ignorance. People knew. They knew about Epstein. They knew about the relationship. They knew about the optics. They knew about the risk. And they chose Mandelson anyway. Why? Because British politics still believes that elite competence excuses moral contamination. Mandelson falls, but too late. Under mounting pressure, Mandelson resigned from the House of Lords, the Labour Party, his ambassadorial role, and suddenly, the same system that protected him began backing away like it had never met him. That's the real British ritual. Use, distance, forget. But resignation is not accountability, it's damage control. And it came after the documents, after the police, after the public outcry. Not because of principle, but because silence stopped working. What this exposes about Britain. This scandal is not an anomaly. It is a stress test, and Britain failed it. Because what the Epstein files exposed wasn't just individuals, it exposed how power circulates without scrutiny, how convicted criminals remain welcome in elite spaces, advice replaces accountability, informal influence outranks democratic legitimacy, and reputational laundering is treated as a skill. Mandelson didn't slip through the cracks were designed for him. Why this matters more than any one man. Let's be brutally clear, this is not about whether Mandelson is guilty of a crime, that's for courts. This is about standards, about why a man with repeated ethical breaches, known proximity to a convicted sexual predator, financial entanglements, and alleged information sharing was still considered safe enough, respectable enough, necessary enough to represent Britain abroad. That is a cultural failure, a moral failure. A failure of imagination so deep that Britain cannot picture power without the same old faces, no matter how compromised. The final truth, here's the line no one in Westminster once spoken out loud. Epstein didn't infiltrate power. Power welcomed him, and Mandelson wasn't a mistake. He was a symptom, a reminder that Britain does not purge its elite, it recycles it, polishes it, rebrands it, until the past comes back with receipts. And this time it did. Why this is not over? So don't ask why people are angry. That question is lazy. That question is for columnists who want to sound confused while knowing exactly what they're doing. The real question is this: why did it take this long? Why did it take American court documents, leaked emails, and a dead man's archive to force Britain to confront what it has been carefully ignoring for decades? Why did it take Jeffrey Epstein, a name so radioactive it melts reputations on contact, to finally break through the protective shell wrapped around Peter Mandelson and the culture that sustains him? Because the truth is uncomfortable, and Britain hates discomfort more than corruption. This was never about one man. Let's say this clearly, slowly, so it can't be misheard. This is not about whether Mandelson committed a crime. That is for investigators and courts. This is about why he was still trusted. Why a man who had already resigned twice under ethical clouds, who operated permanently in the shadow zone between government and capital, who maintained proximity to a convicted sexual predator after conviction, was still treated as indispensable, still elevated, still defended, still waved through. This is about a political culture that treats elite continuity as stability, even when that continuity is morally contaminated. Britain does not fear corruption, it fears disruption. The British elite does not fall, it is lowered gently. In other countries, scandal ends careers. In Britain, scandal triggers a process. Step 1, minimize. Step 2, reframe. Step 3, wait. Step 4, reinsert. Mandelson didn't survive in spite of scandal. He survived because scandal is absorbed by the system, not expelled. Because British power doesn't operate through explosions. It operates through cushions. And every cushion exists to protect the same people. Why Epstein shattered the illusion. Here's why this scandal cut deeper than the others. Epstein is not a political opponent. He is not a rival faction. He cannot be spun as partisan. He is a moral absolute, a convicted trafficker of children, a symbol of elite impunity so extreme it collapsed under its own weight. And when Mandelson's name appeared near that gravity well, not once, not casually, but repeatedly, the usual tricks stopped working. You can survive questions about donors. You can survive whispers about lobbying. You can survive revolving doors. But you cannot survive being adjacent to Epstein without explanation. And Britain had none ready. The silence was the tell. Notice what didn't happen at first. There was no immediate reckoning, no emergency transparency, no full disclosure. There was silence, careful, measured, strategic silence, the kind of silence that assumes the public will get tired, that the news cycle will move on, that people will forget. That silence tells you everything, because if there had been nothing to hide, there would have been speed. If there had been clarity, there would have been openness. Instead, there was delay, the oldest tactic in elite survival. The apology that should never have been necessary, when Keir Starmer apologized, not to Parliament, not to voters, but to Epstein's victims, something fundamental cracked. That moment mattered. Because apologies are admissions of misjudgment, and this wasn't a minor misjudgment. This was a catastrophic failure of vetting, ethics, and political instinct. You do not apologize to victims unless you know the association was indefensible. And once that apology existed, the myth of nothing to see here collapsed. Resignation is not accountability. Mandelson resigned. From the Lords, from the Labour Party, from public roles. And some people breathed out, relieved. Resignation is not justice, it is containment. It is the system saying, we will remove the symbol so you stop asking about the structure. But the structure remains untouched. The same networks, the same donor pipelines, the same culture of informal power. Removing one man does not cleanse the room if the air itself is toxic. The real scandal, who knew and when? Here is the question that should dominate every serious conversation going forward. Who knew about Mandelson's Epstein links and still approved his elevation? Because we already know the answer is not no one. Advisors knew, officials knew, gatekeepers knew, and they calculated that it would be fine. That calculation is the scandal. Not Mandelson's ego, not Epstein's monstrosity, but the quiet decision made behind closed doors that reputational risk was manageable, that the public could be trusted to swallow it. That calculation failed. What this reveals about power in Britain does not live where democracy points. It lives in informal advisory roles, private dinners, transatlantic networks, unminuted conversations, and the people who thrive there are not elected, they are retained. Mandelson was not an outlier, he was a career template. Smooth, unaccountable, untouchable, until he wasn't. And if Britain learns nothing from this, the next version will already be loading. This is why people are done. People aren't angry because they're naive. They're angry because they recognize the pattern. Because they know this isn't about morals, it's about rules that only apply downwards. Because they know that if this were anyone else, younger, poorer, less connected, there would have been no slow walk to the exit. There would have been handcuffs. That double standard is no longer subtle enough to survive. The Epstein files didn't create this, they exposed it. Epstein didn't infiltrate British politics. British politics created the conditions where someone like Epstein could circulate without alarm, where proximity to power outweighed character, where usefulness trumped decency, where access was confused for legitimacy. The files didn't invent the rot, they shone a light on it, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. What happens next is the test. Here is the fork in the road. Option 1. Britain treats this as an aberration, a bad appointment, a lesson learned, and then quietly resumes business as usual. Option 2. Britain asks the harder questions about vetting, about advisory power, about who gets rehabilitated and why, about how many other names are one document dump away from exposure. One path leads to reform, the other leads to repetition. History tells us which one Britain usually chooses. Not right, not left, just real,